of this pandemic is that it has demonstrated the power of science to understand and find solutions to a novel biological catastrophe at an amazing speed under duress. There has been a highly effective vaccination developed in less than a year, whereas they typically take 10 years to develop. And testing of repurposed and novel drugs to treat COVID-19 has also taken place in record time. Last but certainly not least, in my opinion, to understand who is at risk of severe disease and death, the scientific community, in particular immunogerontologists, are starting to shine a bright light on the host and its chronic viral load, or virome, as fertile ground for stratifying risk and finding targets to mitigate disease. So what are the risk factors for severe COVID-19 and mortality? Well, very early on in the pandemic, it became clear that age was a major risk factor. This figure from the CDC shows that in comparison to 40-year-olds, 85-year-olds are over 4 times more affected with regard to hospitalization and have a 63-fold increased risk of death from COVID-19 in comparison to 40-year-olds. But there are other comorbidities that increase risk of COVID-19 and the severity of it, and that is hypertension, diabetes, coronary artery disease, chronic kidney disease, and COPD. Male gender, smoking, obesity, and we're finding a significant relationship between non-white ethnicity and increased risk of COVID-19. So is there an immunological mechanism that explains the risk factors predictive of COVID-19? And I'm going to answer that in the affirmative, and it's called immunosenescence. This is the age-associated process whereby low numbers and percentages of naive T cells increase with age, and they have a lower ability to fight off a wide range of novel pathogens. As you can see in the diagram on the right, in the 3rd decade, at your peak of health, there are many naive T cells and of different types. And there are memory cells in the memory compartment that can fight off previously encountered antigens, such as viruses and tumors, with great effectiveness. So that's a very healthy immune system. By the 7th decade, however, the diversity has decreased, and the number of clones has decreased, but individual ones have started to take over. You see the yellow decreasing and the red increasing in size, but not in number. And by greater than 75 years of age, you have a much lower diversity of naive T cells and a much narrower range of memory cells as well. This results in inflammaging, which leads to increased autoimmune responses and a low-grade inflammation. Now, I'd like to talk today about what immunosenescence is and what causes it. Discuss the immune cell surface markers that aspects of immunosenescence, suggest ways to stratify risk of your patients for severe COVID-19 and potentially how to improve that risk. So immunosenescence is essentially of 2 types, intrinsic and extrinsic. And intrinsic can be divided into thymic involution, which starts in early adulthood. There's an increase of fatty infiltration into the thymus and a decrease of cellularity. So immunosenescence is essentially of 2 types, intrinsic and extrinsic. And intrinsic can be divided into thymic involution, which starts in early adulthood. There's an increase of fatty infiltration into the thymus and a decrease of cellularity, such that by age 50, there is considerably decreased naive T cell output and T cell receptor diversity in comparison to when you are a young adult. The other part of intrinsic aging is a increase in fat infiltration again into the bone marrow with decreased cellular output, but a shift from the lymphoid to the myeloid lineage, increasing PMNs and decreasing lymphocytes. Extrinsic aging is the aspect of immunosenescence that is not as closely linked to the passage of time or the calendar. Some people can have extrinsic aging that takes place at a young age, and some at an older age have much less. This phenomenon was worked out through a series of elegant studies in vitro by Rita Efros in 2005 at UCLA, where she found that after repeated stimulation, cytotoxic T cells were unable to proliferate any further. They stopped proliferating, and similar to fibroblasts as in culture, like in the Hayflick limit, they are still alive, they're not quiescent, but they're resistant to apoptosis and produce inflammatory cytokines such as TNF-alpha and IL-6. And they also decrease the production of interferon gamma to fight off viruses. The major change that takes place here is the loss of the CD28 molecule, which I'm going to be talking a lot about. In addition to the MHC T cell receptor linkage that needs to take place between the APC and the T cell, CD28 has to link up with B7 to cause activation, brisk proliferation, stabilization of MRI, glucose metabolism to function optimally. And all T cells initially in young adulthood express this marker. Now, does this occur in vivo? It turns out that the same marker, CD28, is available in research labs, and also the marker for naive T cells, that is loss of CD95 or absence of expressions of CD95, but they are not routinely available at your Quest or LabCorp or other local laboratory that does lymphocyte subsets as depicted above here. However, there is a center at UCLA called the Immunogenetic Center that does this test for a reasonable price, and we use that in my practice. You can get details on how to do this from TA Sciences or from my website, physioage.com. If you can't get access to these, though, I'm going to talk about this CD4 to CD8 ratio that's readily available that can be a stand-in for looking at the effect of aging immunosenescence in vivo. So what happens has been nicely shown in a number of studies, this one by Nanping Wang in 2009. The naive T cell suppressor cells decrease with age because of a decrease in function of the bone marrow and involution of the thymus, and senescent suppressor cells increase with age, which is part of that replicative senescence. This doesn't happen as much in the CD4 compartment, although it does in autoimmune disorders such as Wegener's granulomatosis and rheumatoid arthritis. What causes this extrinsic immunosenescence in vivo? Well, do you know what this figure is? This is, well, it looks like with these protrusions that it might be COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's actually cytomegalovirus. Human cytomegalovirus is a chronic immune stressor. It's a ubiquitous herpes virus 5, that has a seroprevalence of between 30 and 90% in industrialized countries and 55% in the US. But in many lower middle income countries, 100% of young adults are seropositive. Primary infection is usually asymptomatic, but it can cause up to 10% of cases of mononucleosis. It remains latent in monocytes and endothelial cells and kidney cells lifelong, just as herpes virus 1 remains latent in the trigeminal ganglion, and it requires continuous surveillance by cytotoxic T cells to keep from coming out. This intermittent asymptomatic shedding causes spread through sexual and casual contact. By age 10, 30% of the US population is seropositive, and there's about a 1% per year conversion rate thereafter, such that by 80 years of age, 90% are CMV positive. However, as you can see from this graph, there's a big disparity between non-Hispanic Blacks and Mexican Americans and non-Hispanic whites of about 30 to 40% at every age range. This increase with CMV seropositivity with age was somewhat confusing to immunogerontologists at first because it looked quite a bit like the increase in senescent T cells that took place, and it made it difficult to differentiate the effects of CMV from aging on the immune system. Now, looking at this figure again, you can see that the yellow clones are specific for varicella zoster, and with age, they decrease, causing a need for the booster vaccination or putting you at increased risk for shingles. The main actor in this is CMV, where the number of clones increases and the size of the T cell compartment that is devoted to them can go up to 30% of the memory compartment, taking up immunological space and making it less likely for other memory cells to survive and for naive T cells to be produced. This effect is so dramatic upon primary infection that there can be up to 20 years of immune aging that takes place after primary infection, as depicted in this study by Moss. Now, there are other consequences of immunosenescence in addition to the inflammation caused by immune dysregulation. There is an increase in cancer incidence and mortality because of reduced tumor surveillance. There's an increase in diseases with an inflammatory component, cardiovascular disease, dementia, osteoporosis, and diabetes, and there's an increase in autoimmune disorders in the elderly. What is the effect of these senescent T cells on mortality in the very old? An elegant series of studies done in the 90s in Sweden looked at a cohort of octogenarians, that's why it's called the OCTO trial, and followed them for 6 years. And they found that those who had a CD4 to CD8 ratio less than 1, where it's normally in the 1.5 to 2.5 range, this is primarily because of an increased accumulation of senescent T cells in the denominator, increasing the CD8 compartment, and was also associated with low B cells and CMV positivity. What happened to them after 6 years is that there was an increased 2, 4, and 6-year mortality that was quite significant early on. When they followed this cohort further into their 90s, they found that 16% were in the IRP, and that 100% of those in the IRP died versus 67% non-IRP individuals after 6 years. That is a very significant mortality increase in these relatively healthy individuals that didn't have a lot of comorbidities. Following them further, they found that no centenarians made it into no one made it to become a centenarian if they were in the IRP because they didn't accumulate, because centenarians don't accumulate CD28 negative even if they're CMV positive. They have more of a profile of a CMV negative person. This body of work made myself, and I'm pleased to see 2 prominent authors in the field of immunosenescence think about what the relationship between COVID-19 and CMV might be. Paul Moss wrote in May of 2020, is there an interaction between cytomegalovirus and SARS-CoV-2 infection? And in August, Graham Pollack echoed that same sentiment and wondered whether there was a way to explain the disparities in risk and outcomes in COVID-19 by looking at cytomegalovirus and the aged immune phenotype or the immune risk phenotype. Moss said at the conclusion that cytomegalovirus may act as a negative risk factor for clinical outcome following SARS-CoV-2 infection, and this could be of importance in relation to clinical management and optimization of epidemiological control strategy. Essentially, what both authors pointed out is that the risk factor profile that has been discovered for, in addition to age, for COVID-19 disease and severity of disease is mirrored by CMV. Cardiovascular disease incidence is higher in CMV positive individuals. Arterial stiffness is worse in CMV individuals. Hemoglobin A1C is also higher in type 2 diabetics